The night is still, and the air carries the soft scent of distant rain. Imagine for a moment sitting quietly in an old wooden house, the paper sliding doors slightly open, a single lantern flickering against the walls. This is where our journey begins, in a space of calm reflection, where time moves slowly and voices from the past seem to linger gently in the silence. The history of Japanese folklore and village ghost stories is not one of sudden terror or loud frights. Instead, it is a story told in whispers, in the low crackle of a fire, in the hush of rice fields swaying in the wind. It is a history that soothes as much as it unsettles, one that draws listeners into a softer world where the ordinary and the mysterious coexist without conflict. Japanese folklore has always lived in the rhythm of daily life, in the footsteps of farmers on mountain paths, in the songs sung during planting season, and in the careful rituals that greeted the morning sun. Long before modernity, these stories were carried in voices rather than books, shaped and reshaped as they passed from elder to child, from one household to another, until they became threads in the very fabric of the village. Each story was not simply about ghosts or spirits but about memory, about the way human beings have always sought to explain the silence of night, the strange movement of shadows, or the presence felt when no one else was seen. The calm tone of these tales may surprise those who think of ghost stories as designed only to frighten. In Japan's villages, they often carried a different mood. They were not told with sudden gasps or sharp endings, but with a kind of slow unfolding, a patience that matched the gentle rhythm of life itself. When villagers spoke of a figure on a riverbank or a spirit wandering a mountain road, their voices lowered not in fear but in reverence. The stories asked for stillness, as though listening itself was part of the ritual, a way of connecting the living and the unseen without breaking the fragile thread between worlds. To understand the history of these ghost stories, one must first recognize the quiet respect that shaped them. The natural world was not seen as separate from humanity, but as deeply intertwined. Mountains, forests, rivers, and fields all held spirits, both protective and restless. In this sense, ghost stories were as much about the environment as they were about the supernatural. A Tale of a Woman by the River was not only about her lingering presence, but also about the river itself, its dangers, its life-giving waters, its mysterious currents. These tales invited listeners to tread carefully, to honor the landscape, and to remember that life and death are both carried in the same flow of time. As we begin this exploration, it is important to let the pace remain slow, as though walking step by step through a village path at twilight. The houses are quiet, the fields lie open, and the sound of insects marks the edges of silence. In such a place, folklore feels natural, almost inevitable, as if the stories are waiting in the still air, ready to be spoken. Villagers told them not only to children but to one another, during festivals, in moments of gathering, or on long nights when the darkness pressed close. The atmosphere was not of fear but of shared reflection, a communal rhythm that made the mysterious seem like part of the ordinary. There is also comfort in these stories, many of them told of ancestors who lingered not to haunt but to protect, of lanterns glowing in the night to guide lost travelers, of voices reminding listeners that kindness to strangers and care for one's neighbors could ease unseen tensions. Even when a tale hinted at sorrow or unrest, it was told in a way that acknowledged grief rather than magnified terror. These stories acted as gentle companions, allowing listeners to face the unknown with quiet acceptance rather than dread. As this calm journey unfolds, we will wander through the villages of old Japan, listening to the whispers of elders, to the laughter of children daring one another to linger in the dark, to the crackle of firewood, as stories stretched late into the evening. We will move slowly, not rushing from one tale to the next, but pausing to breathe in the world that gave birth to them. This is not a history of sudden shocks but of lingering moods, of shadows that soften rather than strike. It is the kind of history best listened to in stillness, perhaps with the eyes growing heavy, the body relaxing, and the mind ready to drift between wakefulness and sleep. So let us begin, not with urgency but with patience. The history of Japanese folklore and village ghost stories is a long path winding through time. Each step takes us deeper into the balance of life and spirit, of seen and unseen. The path is quiet, but it is steady, leading us to fields where the wind hums softly, to rivers where reflections blur, to forests where every tree seems alive with memory. Along this path we will encounter not only the ghosts of stories but the calm wisdom they carry, the gentle reminders of how human beings have always found meaning in silence. In this way, the history we are about to explore is not only about Japan's past but about the universal need to tell stories that soothe, stories that guide, and stories that remind us that even in the shadows there can be peace. The morning sun rises gently over the horizon, its soft light spreading across the rice fields, casting long golden lines over the landscape. In the quiet rhythm of old Japanese villages, life began not with the rush of alarms or the clamor of traffic, but with the steady sounds of nature. Roosters crowed, water wheels creaked as they turned, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted from hearths already kindled for the day's first meal. This was the world where folklore lived, not separate from daily existence, but woven into its every detail. The people who told ghost stories were the same who tilled the earth, tended to animals, and gathered at shrines, carrying with them a quiet balance between labor and spirit. To understand the ghostly tales whispered in the evenings, we must first understand the calm, deliberate pattern of life that shaped the listeners. Villages in Japan were often nestled close to rivers or surrounded by mountains, chosen carefully for their access to water and fertile soil. Wooden houses with thatched roofs clustered together, their paper doors sliding open to reveal tatami mats, where families sat close to one another. Every sound carried children's laughter, the call of merchants, the rustle of bamboo in the wind. Though life could be hard, it carried with it a sense of steady familiarity. The planting of rice in spring, the long growing season of summer, the harvest festivals of autumn, and the quiet endurance of winter created a cycle that all villagers knew by heart. These cycles were more than practical necessity. They were a rhythm that gave meaning to life. Within this rhythm, stories found fertile ground, growing as naturally as the crops in the fields. Daily tasks were carried out with ritual-like precision. Farmers bowed to the land before planting, women tended gardens and prepared miso or pickled vegetables, and children gathered water or kindling, learning from their elders with patience. The sounds of carpenters working, of weaving looms, of footsteps along narrow dirt roads created a background music that seemed timeless. Folklore slipped into these moments without effort. A child might hear a grandmother mutter about a fox spirit while tying her sandals, or a fisherman might tell his companion of a restless river ghost while casting his net. The stories were not events separate from life. They were as present as the soil on one's hands or the rain falling on the roof. In these villages, festivals marked the passage of time and gave life a communal rhythm. Lanterns were hung in the summer months, glowing softly against the warm night air. The Bond Festival, honoring the spirits of ancestors, was not a fearful time but a season of joy and remembrance, when villagers believed their loved ones returned to visit. Ghost stories often found their way into these gatherings, not as unwelcome interruptions but as natural companions to the idea that the boundaries between worlds could thin. In the soft glow of festival fires, with drums echoing in the distance and the scent of grilled food rising into the air, people found comfort in speaking of spirits who lingered near. Evenings carried a different mood. When the day's work was finished and the fields grew dark, families gathered indoors. A single lantern might illuminate the room, its light flickering across faces as food was shared and stories began. The rhythm of life was slow, the night long, and in such an atmosphere, a story could stretch unhurried across hours. The stillness of the village outside, the faint croak of frogs in the rice paddies, the wind sighing through the trees, set the perfect backdrop for tales of the unseen. This calm, almost meditative setting made ghost stories something soothing rather than startling. Life in these villages was not without hardship. Winters could be bitter, and harvests sometimes failed. Illness, storms, or floods reminded people of life's fragility. Yet even these challenges were absorbed into the rhythm of existence, met with patience and communal effort. Folklore reflected this endurance. Tales of spirits who punished arrogance or rewarded humility echoed the village's own reliance on cooperation and respect. In this way, folklore was not only entertainment, but also a reflection of the moral order that held communities together. The very structure of the villages contributed to the sharing of stories. Houses were built close, with narrow paths winding between them, so voices and lives were always overlapping. Privacy was rare, and so was loneliness. When one person told a tale, others nearby often heard it too, adding details, recalling similar events, or nodding in agreement. Over time, stories took root in the collective memory of the community. Even a child who had never seen a particular river spirit might speak of it as if it were an old neighbor. As night fell, and the cycle of another day came to rest, villagers found themselves in a world both ordinary and mysterious. The fire crackled, the lantern's glow softened, and shadows stretched long across the wooden walls. In these moments, daily life and ghostly tales intertwined seamlessly. The rice planted that morning, the offerings left at the shrine, the quiet laughter of children, all seemed part of the same world where spirits drifted unseen and ancestors returned in dreams. Life was lived slowly, carefully, and with reverence. In this quiet setting, folklore was not a distraction but an extension of existence itself. This is the world we must picture before we hear of spirits wandering mountain paths or voices echoing across rivers. Without the calm background of village life, the ghost stories lose their shape. It is the stillness of the rice fields, the warmth of shared meals, and the gentle repetition of daily tasks that make the mysterious tales meaningful. The village itself was a stage, its rhythms the steady heartbeat against which folklore could sing softly. With this understanding, we are ready to walk deeper into the world of Japanese ghost stories, carrying with us the calm steadiness of village life, so that each tale is not only heard but felt, as if it belongs naturally to the world around us. Folklore in Japan was never only about passing the time or entertaining children on long winter nights. Here it served a deeper role, one that was woven carefully into the everyday fabric of life, like threads stitched into a cloth so subtly that they became impossible to separate. In the villages scattered across mountains and plains, stories were not told only for their eerie images of wandering spirits or mysterious shapes glimpsed in the twilight. They were told because they carried lessons, quiet, patient teachings about how to live, how to treat others, and how to remain respectful toward the unseen. These lessons were never shouted, never delivered with a heavy hand. Instead, they drifted gently through the words of ghost stories, offering guidance in the same calm way that wind moves through rice stalks or water flows along a stream. The elders who passed on these tales knew that the imagination of a child could grasp truths more readily when wrapped in story. A tale of a spirit waiting at a crossroads was not only about fear of the unknown, but also about teaching children to tread carefully, to be mindful of their steps, and to recognize that the world was full of unseen presences deserving of respect. Stories of fox spirits who could shapeshift into human form carried warnings against deception, but also invited listeners to reflect on the fragile balance between trust and suspicion. In this way, folklore taught lessons without ever naming them directly. The story carried the teaching like a boat carries a passenger across a quiet river. It was in the gentle repetition of these stories that their lessons took root. A grandmother might tell the same tale many times, adjusting it slightly with each retelling, and the children would listen, absorbing not only the words but the pauses, the tone, the rhythm of her voice. Over time, the lesson became inseparable from the story itself. To hear of a spirit haunting a bridge was not only to imagine the spirit, but to feel the weight of the bridge itself as a place of caution, a threshold where the living and unseen worlds might touch. The story shaped behavior, not through rules but through quiet impressions. Folklore also acted as a guide for relationships within the community. Many ghost stories warned against selfishness or cruelty, suggesting that those who failed to act kindly might face consequences beyond the grave. A villager who ignored their duties or treated neighbors harshly could easily become the subject of whispers, their actions framed through the lens of a cautionary tale. In this way, stories reinforced the importance of harmony. They reminded listeners that the well-being of the community depended on balance, patience, and respect. To live without regard for these values risked inviting unrest, both from the living and from the spirits who watched silently. The natural world, too, was part of these quiet teachings. Rivers, forests, and mountains were not seen as empty landscapes but as living presences. Folklore taught that every place held a spirit, and therefore deserved reverence. To waste food was to insult the spirits of the harvest. To carelessly damage a tree was to disturb the spirit dwelling within. Even the act of leaving offerings at a roadside shrine or bowing at a village temple was shaped by these stories, which explained in gentle terms why such respect mattered. It was never presented as an abstract lesson, but as something felt through the image of a restless ghost or the story of a protective ancestor watching from nearby. The calm power of these tales came not only from their content but from the way they were told. Storytelling itself was a ritual, often unfolding slowly by lamplight, with silences stretching as naturally as the words. Children listened with wide eyes, adults nodded knowingly, and all shared in the stillness that the stories created. In this atmosphere, the lesson felt less like instruction and more like a shared understanding. It was as if everyone present was reminded, together, of what mattered: humility, kindness, respect for nature, and reverence for the unseen threads that bind life together. There was also a healing quality in these stories. Grief and loss were common in village life, and ghost stories often reflected the presence of loved ones who had passed away. Rather than fueling terror, such tales offered comfort, suggesting that ancestors lingered nearby, watching, guiding, and sometimes even protecting. The lesson in these stories was one of acceptance that death was not an end but a continuation, a shift into another form of presence. To hear that a departed relative might visit in the shape of a glowing lantern or a gentle breeze was to find peace in the idea that bonds were never truly broken. Folklore also provided a way to face fears indirectly. Instead of confronting danger or sorrow directly, villagers could tell a story that symbolized it. A ghost haunting a river could represent the danger of drowning, reminding children to stay safe without frightening them with blunt warnings. A tale of spirits punishing greed was a way to talk about fairness and sharing without turning to lectures. Through these indirect lessons, listeners could reflect without resistance, absorbing wisdom as naturally as they absorbed the rhythm of daily life. As one listens to these stories in the imagination, the sense of calm becomes clear. They do not rush, they do not force, they simply unfold like a path winding gently through a village. With each step, the listener is guided toward a deeper awareness of life's fragile balance. The teachings within them are not heavy or urgent but soft, like echoes fading slowly in the evening air. This gentleness is part of what makes Japanese folklore unique, and part of why these ghost stories lingered for centuries, passed from mouth to ear, from firelight to firelight, always carrying their quiet lessons. By seeing folklore as a gentle teacher, we begin to understand why these stories were treasured and repeated. They were never simply tales of the supernatural but were vessels of cultural wisdom, reminders of the invisible threads that bind communities together. As the village prepared for another day of labor, or rested under the stars, these stories reminded them, softly, steadily, that respect, patience and humility would always be needed to walk the narrow path of life. It is this calm guiding quality that allows us to enter the deeper world of Japanese ghost stories with open hearts, ready to see them not as frightening interruptions but as quiet companions in the journey of human existence. In the heart of Japan's countryside, where mountains rise like silent guardians and rivers wind their way gently through valleys, the presence of spirits has long been felt. To the people of the villages, these landscapes were never empty. Every tree, every stone, every stream carried within it a quiet essence, a spirit that lived unseen but not unfelt. This idea came naturally, born of Shinto belief and shaped by centuries of living so close to the rhythms of nature. To walk through a forest was never simply to pass among trees, it was to move through a world alive with invisible companions. To drink from a river was not just to quench thirst, but to share in the life of the spirit who resided in its waters. The natural world was never separate, never silent. It was always inhabited, always awake, always near. Spirits in nature were not imagined as distant or hostile but as present forces deserving of respect. A farmer crossing a mountain pass might pause to bow his head, offering a silent greeting to the unseen guardian of that path. A child warned not to wander too far into the forest would not hear only of wild animals or hidden dangers, but of spirits watching from the shadows of cedar trunks. These teachings were gentle, almost tender, shaping a way of life that treated the world with reverence. A villager did not cut down a tree without thought, for within its trunk was believed to dwell a living presence. To disturb it carelessly was to risk unrest, a lesson not shouted but softly suggested through stories told by firelight. The mountains held a special place in this spiritual imagination. They loomed high above the villages, their slopes covered in mist, their peaks often hidden by drifting clouds. Mountains were seen as the dwelling places of gods and ancestral spirits, their remote heights belonging to realms beyond ordinary human reach. Villagers climbing narrow paths to gather firewood or forage mushrooms might whisper quiet prayers, asking permission to enter, acknowledging that they stepped into sacred space. In folklore, many mountain spirits appeared as guides or protectors, reminding travelers of the balance between humility and courage. The calm, steady telling of these tales carried the same sense of respect as the footsteps of villagers who climbed carefully, never forgetting that they were guests in the realm of the mountain. Rivers, too, carried their own spirits. Flowing constantly, changing with each season, rivers were seen as both life-giving and potentially dangerous. Ghost stories about rivers often warned children to stay away from strong currents or to treat water with care, yet these stories were not told harshly. Instead, they described beautiful women appearing at riverbanks, or mysterious lights hovering above the surface at night, soft reminders that beneath the gentle sound of flowing water there lived unseen beings. Offerings of flowers or rice would sometimes be left along riverbanks, not out of fear but as gestures of respect. The calm lapping of water against the shore was enough to remind villagers that the river was never only water, it was also spirit, memory and presence. Even the smallest details of the landscape carried meaning. Stones by the roadside could hold spirits, and travelers often left pebbles or coins as offerings. Old trees with twisted roots were believed to be inhabited, and shrines were built at their bases, creating spaces where villagers could pause, bow and feel the quiet nearness of the unseen world. Fields of rice were not just sources of food but sacred places where spirits of fertility and harvest lived, their well-being tied directly to the labor of farmers. This sense of animating spirit gave the land itself a voice, one that was heard through folklore and echoed softly in the rhythms of daily life. In this way, ghost stories often merged with the natural landscape. A tale of a woman appearing in the mist was not told as a horror, but as a gentle acknowledgement of the mountain's mystery. A story of strange lights moving through rice fields at night was not meant to alarm but to remind villagers of the sacredness of the harvest. The unseen and the seen blended together seamlessly, and the lesson was always one of humility. To live in harmony with nature was to live in harmony with the spirits that filled it. To ignore this balance was to invite unease, not only in the world of the unseen but also in the quiet workings of everyday life. The seasons shaped the presence of these spirits as much as the land did. Spring brought renewal with blossoms carrying the spirits of hope and rebirth. Summer nights heavy with heat were said to invite spirits to wander more freely, their presence felt in the shimmering air and the flicker of lantern light. Autumn carried the voices of ancestors, honored during festivals with dances and offerings that blurred the line between the living and the departed. Winter's silence, deep and enduring, seemed to belong entirely to the unseen, as if the land itself drew inward to rest alongside the spirits waiting in snow-covered forests and frozen rivers. Folklore flowed with these rhythms, offering stories that matched the mood of each season, always reminding villagers of the presence beyond the visible. Even in moments of loss, the natural world provided comfort through its spiritual presence. When someone passed away, families believed their spirit joined the unseen life of mountains, rivers, or ancestral hearths. Stories of glowing lanterns appearing in the distance, or gentle breezes carrying the sense of a loved one nearby, helped ease grief with calm reassurance. The idea that the natural world could cradle the spirits of ancestors made the landscape itself feel like family, a place where the departed were never truly gone but transformed into part of the living environment. This belief in spirits within nature shaped not only stories but actions. Rituals at shrines, seasonal festivals, offerings of food and incense, all of these were ways of maintaining balance, gestures that kept harmony between villagers and the unseen world. Ghost stories, when told, reflected this balance. They were not meant to terrify but to remind, not to startle but to steady. They told listeners that to walk through a forest or sit by a river was never to be alone, and that companionship could come as much from spirits as from neighbors. To step back into this world is to hear the landscape itself as part of the story. The rustling of bamboo, the trickle of water, the sigh of the wind, each sound is a voice, each presence a reminder of the invisible. In the calm telling of folklore, these spirits are not distant but intimate, part of every breath and every step. They invite listeners not to fear the unknown, but to move gently within it, to recognize that life is never lived in solitude. Every mountain, every stream, every tree is alive with presence, and the stories of the villagers simply give words to what the heart already knows, that the natural world is full of spirit, and that to live with respect is to live in peace. In the quiet of the countryside, where lanterns glow faintly against the night and the sound of frogs drifts across the rice paddies, ghost stories were often told with a surprising gentleness. These were not tales meant to shock listeners with sudden fright, but to accompany them into the soft hours of evening when the world slowed and the line between the seen and unseen seemed to blur. The spirits of the countryside were familiar presences, as natural to the villagers as the wind through the fields or the rustle of bamboo by the roadside. To speak of them was not to stir fear but to share a reminder that life was always touched by something beyond the ordinary, something both calm and mysterious. Among the most common figures in these stories were the spirits of ancestors. Villagers believed that their departed loved ones lingered near, not as menacing ghosts but as watchful guardians. At night, especially during the season of Obon, families lit lanterns to guide ancestral spirits back to their homes. The flickering light was a comfort, a sign that those who had passed were never far away. Stories told of ancestors appearing in dreams to offer advice, or of a faint presence felt in the doorway during moments of hardship. These encounters were not recounted with fear but with reverence, a gentle reassurance that bonds of family and memory extended beyond death. The countryside was also home to stories of guiding lights. Villagers sometimes spoke of lanterns appearing along dark roads, glowing faintly in the distance, and then vanishing. Once the traveler had safely reached home, these were thought to be protective spirits, perhaps ancestors, perhaps kindly beings of the land itself. Rather than terrifying wanderers, the lights offered comfort in the darkness, as if the unseen world provided companionship for those who walked alone. The soft glow of these mysterious lanterns became part of the nighttime landscape, woven into the experience of moving through the countryside after dusk. Water, always a source of life and danger, also held spirits with a gentle character. In some villages, tales were told of mill spirits who watched over the turning of wooden wheels by rivers and streams. These spirits were believed to help keep the flow steady, to ensure the mill's work continued, and to guard against sudden accidents. Children were told that the soft creaking of the mill was the voice of the spirit itself, speaking in rhythm with the water. Such stories encouraged respect for the tools of survival while softening the mechanical sounds of the village with a sense of companionship. There were also tales of animals imbued with a protective spirit. Dogs or cats that had lived faithfully in a household were sometimes believed to linger after death, guarding their homes and families from harm. A dog's bark heard late at night, though no dog was seen, might be explained as the spirit of a loyal companion standing watch. Cats, often mysterious in behavior, were thought to carry deep spiritual power, and stories of their lingering presence suggested both caution and care. These animal spirits, like the ancestral ones, were not told of with alarm but with appreciation, a recognition that love and loyalty could stretch beyond the limits of a single lifetime. One of the gentlest figures in countryside folklore was the spirit of the lantern woman, a tale passed in variations from village to village. She was said to appear holding a glowing lantern, walking slowly along roads where travelers might lose their way. Her presence was calm, her movements steady, and though she vanished if approached, the light she carried often led wanderers safely back to their path. The story carried with it no malice, only a sense of quiet mystery, as though the spirit world itself cared for those who strayed too far. Told by the fireside, the tale of the lantern woman soothed listeners with the idea that even in darkness, light could appear, unexpected but welcome. In addition to these guiding spirits, the countryside had its stories of household protectors, small unseen beings believed to watch over families. Some were described as ancestral presences lingering in hearths or corners, others as spirits that had attached themselves to a home over many generations. These tales were often shared with children as explanations for sudden creaks in the night or the shifting of shadows against paper walls. Instead of instilling dread, they gave comfort. The sounds of the house were not emptiness, but signs that protective presences remained near. The idea of never being truly alone was presented not as a warning but as a reassurance. Even the fields, wide and open beneath the stars, carried their gentle ghosts. Farmers told stories of figures glimpsed among the rice stalks, shapes that moved with the wind but seemed touched by something more. These spirits were said to watch over the crops, ensuring abundance for those who treated the land with respect. If a harvest was plentiful, villagers might quietly thank the unseen presences for their generosity. Such tales tied survival and spirit together, reminding listeners that gratitude was as important as labor in sustaining life. In summer, when nights were warm and insects sang endlessly, ghost stories were told outdoors, with villagers sitting on verandas or gathered near open doors. Children leaned against their parents, listening to the slow voices of elders as these gentle tales unfolded. The air was heavy, but the mood was light. Fireflies drifted above the paddies, their glowing bodies echoing the stories of lantern lights and guiding spirits. The effect was calming, a blending of natural wonder and supernatural presence that lulled listeners into a reflective stillness. The important feature of these countryside ghost stories was their tone. They did not rush, they did not demand alarm, and they rarely ended in horror. Instead, they settled into the mind like ripples on a pond, slowly spreading until they became part of the listener's sense of place. The stories explained why the world felt full, why silence seemed alive, why shadows carried weight. They offered reassurance that even in the darkness of night, companionship existed, whether in the form of ancestors, animals, or protective spirits of land and water. Through these tales, villagers came to see their world as layered, with the visible and invisible coexisting quietly. To tell of a lantern glowing in the distance, or a presence watching at the edge of a field, was not to frighten but to affirm the depth of reality. These were reminders that kindness extended beyond the living, that gratitude was always acknowledged, and that the unseen often walked gently alongside the seen. In the countryside, ghost stories did not unsettle sleep, but instead invited it, easing listeners into dreams with the calm knowledge that they were never truly alone. As the night deepens and the lanterns grow dim, the mood of the countryside ghost stories begins to shift. While many tales were gentle and comforting, told to reassure children of ancestral protection or guiding spirits, there were others that lingered in the shadows with a quieter unease. These were not tales of loud terror or sudden fright, but of subtle presences, of figures glimpsed at the edges of vision, of voices heard when no one seemed near. In villages where daily life was steady and routine, these stories introduced a note of mystery, a reminder that the world held corners beyond understanding. They were not meant to shock but to instill caution, teaching listeners to move through the darkness with humility and care. Among the most common shadowed tales were those of lost travelers. Roads between villages were long, often winding through forests or across rivers, with only the moon to guide the way. A villager returning late might speak of encountering a figure standing silently by the roadside, dressed in white, unmoving. When approached, the figure would vanish, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the night air. These tales carried with them an uneasy calm, suggesting that the world between destinations was never entirely empty. For listeners, the lesson was clear: to travel carefully, never to boast of one's safety, and always to respect the unknown spaces between home and home. Rivers often appeared in these darker stories as well. Though they could be sources of life and gentle guardians, they also held dangers that folklore did not ignore. Some tales spoke of women seen at the water's edge, weeping softly, their faces hidden by long hair. These figures, neither entirely benevolent nor malevolent, embodied sorrow more than malice. They reminded listeners of the lives lost to rivers, drownings, floods, the tragedies that every community knew. The calm telling of such tales allowed villagers to acknowledge grief without speaking it directly. The spirits by the water were not so much monsters as echoes, shadows of memory lingering where the current carried them away. Twilight, too, was a time when shadows seemed to stir. Villagers told of solitary figures appearing at dusk, standing in the distance as the day's last light faded. Some said they were spirits who had lost their way, searching for homes long gone. Others believed they were warnings, urging those still outside to return before night fully claimed the land. These figures were not described in violent detail. They were vague, indistinct, almost dreamlike. Their power lay not in fear but in suggestion, in the way they reminded listeners that night was not for wandering but for rest, for gathering close to the hearth where safety could be found. Not all of these stories were sorrowful. Some carried with them a quiet sense of justice. There were tales of spirits lingering in villages after lives cut short by betrayal or cruelty. Their presence was said to bring discomfort, not to the innocent, but to those who had acted selfishly or dishonorably. A dishonest merchant might feel watched at night. A cruel landlord might hear knocking on his walls when no one stood outside. These stories offered moral guidance through subtle unease, showing that actions carried consequences not only in this life but beyond. For the listeners, the lesson was steady: live justly, or the shadows will remind you of your failings. Children heard softened versions of these tales, warnings woven into ghostly imagery. A child who disobeyed and wandered too far from home might be told of spirits that lingered at the village edge, waiting silently at the border between fields and forest. The story did not end in harm, but in unease, enough to remind the child of the importance of staying close, of respecting the boundaries drawn by family and tradition. Such stories were never shouted in anger, but told in calm voices, their unease seeping gently into memory. In the long winters when snow covered the rooftops and the night stretched endlessly, these darker tales held special weight. The quiet isolation of the season seemed to echo the themes of absence and loneliness found in the stories. A spirit walking through snow-covered fields, leaving no footprints behind, was an image that stayed with listeners, not as terror but as mystery. The stillness of winter made it easy to imagine unseen figures moving in the silence, reminding villagers of both the fragility and endurance of life. What is striking about these shadowed tales is the calmness with which they were shared. A story of a spirit by the river was not shouted or dramatized, but spoken slowly, as though the storyteller had seen it themselves and simply wanted to share the truth. The tone kept the story balanced, never tipping into hysteria, always returning to a sense of acceptance. The world contained shadows, yes, but they were part of the same balance that included protective spirits and guiding lights. To hear of them was not to despair but to learn, to recognize that sorrow and unease walked alongside comfort and joy. The moral lessons hidden within these stories deepened their impact. A tale of a lonely ghost was a reminder to care for one's neighbors, to ensure no one was left isolated. A story of a spirit restless by the river was a call to honor the dangers of nature and to live with respect for its power. The presence of shadows taught villagers that life was never entirely secure, but that through humility, kindness, and reverence, one could live in harmony with the unseen. In this way, the darker ghost stories were not merely entertainments but subtle guides, teaching caution and empathy in equal measure. In the countryside, the night was long and full of silence. To sit in a room lit only by a single lantern, hearing the slow telling of a story about a spirit wandering the edge of the village, was to feel both the fragility and strength of life. These stories did not aim to disturb sleep, but to settle the mind into reflection, to let listeners drift between wakefulness and dreaming with the knowledge that the world held mysteries beyond their grasp. The shadows, like the daylight, were part of the rhythm of life, and by acknowledging them calmly, villagers found peace even in unease. In Japanese folklore, the image of the yūrei, the wandering spirit, slowly took form over centuries, shaped by belief, custom, and imagination, all than just by me. Unlike the gentle household presences or the vague shadows at the village edge, the yūrei became a more defined figure, recognizable across regions and stories. They were most often described as women dressed in white, with long, unbound black hair falling loosely around their faces, their movements quiet and their presence lingering like mist. Though they carried with them an atmosphere of sorrow, their stories were told in calm tones, not to create terror, but to paint a picture of the way grief and unfinished business might stretch beyond the limits of a single lifetime. The white clothing was significant, for it resembled the garments of death in Japanese tradition, attire used to dress the body for burial. When listeners heard of a figure clothed in white, they understood immediately that the tale belonged to the world of the departed. The long hair, too, carried meaning. In daily life, hair was bound and arranged neatly, a sign of order and propriety, but in stories of yūrei, the unbound hair symbolized a release from the constraints of life, a letting go that connected the spirit to a more primal and sorrowful state. In the calm telling of such details, storytellers painted a portrait of the ghost that was vivid yet dreamlike, hovering between reality and imagination. The presence of the yūrei was often linked to strong emotions left unresolved: sorrow, longing, betrayal, or deep love that had no closure. These were said to give rise to spirits who could not move on. In villages where daily life was defined by cycles of work and ritual, such tales provided an explanation for the weight of emotion that everyone, at some point, carried. A woman abandoned or betrayed might linger as a yūrei, her presence not violent but heavy with yearning. A parent taken too soon might return to watch quietly over children. The stories acknowledged the power of emotion, while placing it within the slow, steady rhythm of life and death. Though some depictions of yūrei in later art and theatre became dramatic, in the villages the stories retained a softer tone. A traveler might describe hearing footsteps in an empty corridor, or seeing a pale figure reflected in a well at night. A fisherman might tell of a woman in white standing on the shore, her gaze fixed on the sea as though waiting for someone who would never return. These stories did not rush toward shocking conclusions. Instead, they lingered on atmosphere, on the sense of presence that seemed both close and unreachable, like a dream that leaves its imprint long after waking. The idea of the yūrei also connected to Buddhist beliefs about attachment and release. In Buddhist thought, to move on after death required letting go of earthly ties. Spirits unable to do so were believed to remain bound, caught between this world and the next. In the calm storytelling of the villages, the yūrei embodied this struggle. They were not described as demons or monsters, but as figures caught in transition, their lingering presence a reminder of the difficulty of release. Listeners heard these tales not with terror but with reflection, recognizing within them the human struggle to let go of sorrow, anger, and longing. In theater, particularly in No and later in kabuki, the image of the yūrei took on a more stylized form, reinforcing the cultural picture. Plays presented women in white robes, moving slowly, their hair loose, their faces pale. Yet even in performance the mood was not one of sudden horror but of solemnity, a slow unfolding of emotion expressed through ritualized movement. These performances echoed the village stories, presenting the yūrei as figures of melancholy beauty, reminders of the emotions that linger when life cannot fully close its circle. Stories of yūrei often unfolded near thresholds, by rivers, at bridges, in doorways, or at crossroads. These were places of transition, neither fully one thing nor another, just as the spirits themselves were neither fully gone nor fully present. To hear of a yūrei standing silently on a bridge at night was to hear of the liminal, the space between worlds. Such images were not told with haste or urgency, they were spoken slowly, letting the listener imagine the quiet of the night, the stillness of the river, the faint figure standing with eyes cast downward. The atmosphere was more dream than nightmare, a mood that lulled the mind rather than startled it awake. Even in their sadness, the yūrei stories often carried lessons. They spoke of the importance of closure, of honoring the dead properly, of tending to relationships so that sorrow would not fester unresolved. They reminded listeners of the bonds of family, of the need for compassion, of the inevitability of loss. By telling these stories, villagers wove memory and moral guidance together, wrapping lessons in atmosphere rather than command. To fall asleep hearing of a yūrei was not to be haunted, but to be reminded gently of life's fragility and the continuity between past and present. The image of the yūrei, lingering quietly in the imagination, connected generations across time. Grandparents told of spirits seen on roads long vanished, and children listened with wide eyes, picturing pale figures who moved like the mist. Over time, the tales became part of the cultural fabric, carried not only in words but in images, in plays, in paintings, until the figure of the woman in white became almost universal. Yet beneath the artistic flourishes, the core remained the same, a spirit born of strong feeling, still present, still tied to the living world. In the end, the yūrei stories were not frightening interruptions to village life, but part of its rhythm. They explained the quiet unease of certain nights, the sense of presence in certain places, the emotional weight that lingered in memory. Told slowly and calmly, they eased listeners into reflection, inviting them to drift towards sleep with the soft image of a figure standing in the distance, neither threatening nor comforting, simply there, a reminder of life's mysteries, carried on the edge of the unseen. The passing of seasons shaped not only the rhythms of labor in the village, but also the rhythms of its ghost stories. Just as planting and harvest followed predictable cycles, so too did the telling of tales about spirits, ancestors, and the unseen. Each season carried with it a mood, a set of images and sounds, and with those came stories that echoed the atmosphere of the time. This connection between nature and folklore gave the stories a grounding in daily life, weaving the supernatural into the turning of the year so smoothly that listeners felt the presence of spirits as part of the natural world itself. Summer, with its long days and heavy nights, was the most famous season for ghost stories. The heat lingered into the evening, and families gathered on verandas to escape the stifling air indoors. Crickets chirped endlessly, frogs sang from the paddies, and fireflies flickered against the darkness. In this stillness, stories of spirits seemed to fit naturally, as if the heavy air itself carried whispers from another world. The season of Obon, when ancestors were believed to return, added depth to this atmosphere. Lanterns floated on rivers, guiding spirits home, and villagers told tales of ancestors appearing in dreams or footsteps heard softly outside the house. The stories were not alarming but reflective, reminding listeners that summer nights were filled with presences, seen and unseen, all returning to share in the warmth of memory. Autumn shifted the tone. The harvest season was a time of gratitude, but it also carried a sense of melancholy, as fields emptied and the air grew crisp. Ghost stories of autumn often spoke of endings, of spirits glimpsed in fields now barren, of figures standing among falling leaves. The sound of the wind through the trees seemed to carry voices, and villagers told of ancestors who lingered at the edges of the fields, watching over the work and ensuring that the harvest was gathered properly. The stories of autumn were quieter, less vivid than those of summer, but more reflective, aligning with the season's mood of transition and decline. They encouraged listeners to honor the cycle of life, to recognize that abundance was always followed by stillness, and that presence could be felt even in emptiness. Winter brought the longest nights and with them, a particular weight to ghost stories. The snow-muffled sound, turning the world into silence broken only by the creak of wood and the moan of the wind. Stories told in winter were often about loneliness, of travelers lost in snowstorms, of spirits wandering through white fields, leaving no footprints behind, of faint figures glimpsed in the distance against the endless expanse of snow. These tales carried no sudden terror, but a quiet, almost soothing sorrow, echoing the isolation of the season itself. Families huddled close to the hearth, and the stories they heard reminded them that even in solitude, there were presences moving silently beyond the walls, unseen but near. Spring, by contrast, was a season of renewal, and even ghost stories seemed to lighten with the blooming of plum and cherry blossoms. Tales told in spring often carried themes of release, spirits who finally departed after long sorrow, or protective presences that blessed the planting season. The return of color and warmth made the idea of spirits less heavy, more gentle, as if even the unseen world celebrated the new cycle of life. A pale figure by a blossoming tree might not be described as frightening, but as part of the season's beauty, lingering just long enough to remind villagers that life and death were bound together in the turning of time. Festivals played a role in shaping these seasonal rhythms. Obon in the summer was the most central, its dances, lanterns and offerings designed to honor and welcome the dead. Ghost stories told during Obon carried weight because they echoed the rituals of the season, stories of ancestors visiting, of spirits appearing in the glow of lanterns, of footsteps returning to familiar doorways. These stories affirmed what the festival already expressed, that the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and that remembering those who had passed was not only tradition, but necessity. In autumn and spring, smaller festivals honored deities of harvest and planting, and stories of protective spirits echoed the same themes. In winter, the long nights themselves felt like a festival of silence, where ghost stories filled the role of keeping company with the cold and the dark. The rhythm of these seasonal stories gave structure to the year. Just as planting followed winter, and harvest followed summer, ghost stories arose naturally with the atmosphere of each time. They were not arbitrary, but deeply connected to the cycles that governed life. Listeners could feel the truth of this rhythm, the heat of summer calling forth tales of wandering spirits, the quiet of winter evoking lonely figures in the snow, the renewal of spring suggesting the release of the sorrowful, and the decline of autumn speaking softly of endings. What made these seasonal ghostly rhythms so effective was their subtlety. They did not impose themselves suddenly, but arose gently from the environment, blending with sounds, sights and feelings already present. To hear a story of a lantern spirit in summer was to hear something that matched the glow of fireflies and the warmth of the night. To hear of a pale traveler in the snow was to picture them immediately against the white stillness outside the door. These connections made the stories believable, not because they were proven, but because they felt true to the season's mood. In this way, ghost stories became part of the cycle of life itself, woven into the turning of the year. They gave meaning to silence, to heat, to snow, to blossoms. They accompanied villagers through work and rest, through abundance and scarcity, through warmth and cold. Listened to in calm voices, they became part of the background of life, easing transitions, and giving form to feelings that might otherwise have no words. To fall asleep during such a story was to fall into rhythm with the seasons themselves, carried by the quiet assurance that both life and death move gently in circles, always returning, always passing, always present in their own time. The forests and mountains of Japan, vast and enduring, have always been places of mystery. For villagers who lived on the edges of these landscapes, the woods were both resource and danger, both shelter and unknown. They provided timber, herbs, and hunting grounds, yet they were also home to presences that could not be explained by ordinary sight. In the calm unfolding of ghost stories, the forest became a place where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was especially thin. Tales told of quiet voices among the trees, faint lights deep in the woods, and figures glimpsed along mountain paths, all spoken with the slow certainty of stories meant not to frighten, but to remind listeners of the vastness that surrounded their small villages. The forest spirits were varied in nature. Some were described as protective beings who guided travelers, while others were said to mislead those who walked carelessly. One of the most common experiences villagers spoke of was getting lost, even on familiar paths. A turn taken wrongly, a familiar landmark suddenly gone, a path that seemed to twist back on itself. These were often explained as the work of forest spirits. Rather than loud or menacing, the stories described the forest as quietly deceptive, gently pulling wanderers off their intended way. To prevent this, villagers would leave offerings at shrines near the forest edge, asking the spirits for safe passage. The stories did not blame the forest but urged respect, reminding listeners that nature had its own rules. The mountains, even more so than the forests, carried weight in folklore. Remote, covered in mist and difficult to traverse, they were seen as sacred places where humans rarely belonged for long. Stories told of figures in white moving across mountain ridges, appearing one moment and gone the next. Some said these were yūrei, wandering spirits tied to sorrow, while others believed they were mountain kami, ancient deities still present in the peaks. The tone of these stories was always solemn, never frantic, for the mountains demanded reverence. Listeners were left with the sense that to walk among the high places was to walk in the presence of something greater, unseen but powerful. One recurring story was of faint music heard in the forest at night. Travelers resting by trees would sometimes claim to hear the sound of flutes or drums drifting through the darkness. They could not tell where it came from, nor could they follow it. The sound would fade if pursued but linger if one remained still. These tales were told without embellishment, spoken softly as if they might be true even in the moment of telling. The music was thought to be the work of spirits or of long-vanished festivals still echoing among the trees. It was not a threat but a reminder of unseen presences, a song of the forest that kept its own rhythm apart from human time. The animals of the forest also played roles in ghostly tales. Foxes or kitsune were often spoken of as shapeshifters, able to appear as women or travelers to confuse or guide those they encountered. In villages, these stories were told slowly, with more wonder than fear. A man might meet a stranger on a path, share words with them, and later realize no footprints had been left behind. A traveler might spend a night with a hospitable family in the forest, only to discover the next day that no house existed there. These tales carried an air of quiet strangeness rather than alarm, suggesting that the forest held lives parallel to human ones, lives that appeared only in glimpses. The mountains were also places where monks and ascetics retreated to seek enlightenment. Their presence added to the aura of mystery, for villagers sometimes spoke of encountering strange figures who seemed half human, half spirit, wandering in the mist. Whether they were holy men or something else was left deliberately unclear. Stories told of glowing figures praying in caves, of lights on mountain slopes where no fires should have been. These tales encouraged listeners to respect not only the spiritual power of the mountains but the devotion of those who sought wisdom there. Children were told simpler versions of these stories, often framed as gentle warnings. They were told not to wander too far into the forest without guidance, lest they follow a spirit's call and lose their way. They were told not to shout loudly in the mountains, for echoes might awaken unseen presences. These stories, though built on caution, were shared in soothing voices, teaching respect for the natural world without stirring terror. The forest and mountain spirits were not enemies but neighbors, living alongside humans in spaces that demanded humility. Seasonal changes deepened the mood of forest and mountain stories. In spring, when mist clung to the mountains, tales of figures appearing and vanishing in the fog were told. In summer, when the forest was alive with insects and birds, stories of music and lantern lights hidden among the trees were shared. Autumn brought accounts of figures moving among the falling leaves, while winter deepened the sense of isolation, with stories of pale travelers glimpsed on snowy slopes. The forest and mountains seemed to shift character with the seasons, and the stories shifted with them, always aligned to the atmosphere of the world outside. What united all of these whispers of the forest was the sense of calm mystery. There were no sudden frights, no sharp cries in the night. Instead, there were voices that blended with the wind, lights that echoed fireflies, figures that matched the mist. The stories flowed into the environment, becoming indistinguishable from it. To hear them was to listen to the forest itself, to feel the weight of the mountains, to remember that the world was larger and deeper than the daily routines of the village. For villagers, these stories were reminders of balance. The forest gave wood and food, but it also demanded respect. The mountains provided water and spiritual refuge, but they required humility. By telling stories of spirits and unseen presences, communities acknowledged the vastness of nature and their own small place within it. The whispers of the forest were not threats but voices of reminder, guiding people to live with awareness and reverence. In this way, ghost stories did not separate the supernatural from the natural but wove them together, allowing listeners to fall asleep with the gentle knowledge that even the deepest woods and highest peaks were part of a shared living world. Folklore in the Japanese countryside was never told merely for entertainment. Beneath the quiet images of lanterns glowing in the dark, of pale figures by rivers or of voices carried by the wind, there were always lessons meant to guide the living. These stories acted as a moral compass, pointing villagers toward ways of living that fostered respect, kindness, humility, and balance. They were never framed as rules, never delivered as commands. Instead, they were softened through atmosphere and story, sinking gently into memory. A child who drifted to sleep listening to a tale of a restless spirit might not remember every detail, but they would remember the feeling that to live well was to avoid causing sorrow, and to honor what could not be seen was as important as honoring what could. One of the strongest lessons carried in these stories was the importance of respect. Ghost stories often emphasized the consequences of carelessness or arrogance. A traveler who ignored a shrine at the forest's edge might find themselves lost in circles until they humbled themselves and offered prayer. A villager who mocked the unseen might hear knocking on their walls at night, not to harm them but to remind them of their folly. These tales did not punish the innocent, they corrected the proud. In their calm telling, the stories reinforced the idea that life was larger than human will, and that respect for nature, ancestors, and unseen presences was the foundation of harmony. Another lesson woven into folklore was compassion. Many spirits were described not as vengeful but as sorrowful, lingering because of grief or longing. To encounter such a spirit in a story was not to fear them but to feel pity for them. A woman by the river weeping for a loved one lost to the current, a pale figure on a bridge waiting endlessly for someone who would never return. These were images of sadness, not horror. By hearing and retelling these stories, villagers learned to approach others with gentleness, for sorrow was understood as a common thread that bound both the living and the dead. In this way, ghost stories taught empathy, inviting listeners to see even spirits as deserving of compassion. Justice, too, found expression in folklore. Stories told of spirits returning not to harm indiscriminately but to remind wrongdoers of their actions. A greedy merchant might be haunted by faint voices counting his coins at night. A cruel landowner might see pale figures lingering in his fields, reminders of the suffering he caused. These tales balanced the scales of morality without needing harsh decrees. They whispered to listeners that injustice would not go unnoticed, that even if human courts failed, the unseen world remembered. Told slowly and calmly, these stories instilled a quiet belief that kindness and fairness were always the wiser path. For children, ghost stories often carried simple but important warnings disguised in imagery. A tale of spirits at the village edge reminded them not to wander too far alone. A story of unseen presences in rivers taught them to respect the water and avoid reckless play. A warning about fox spirits who could trick the careless taught them to be cautious with strangers. Delivered in gentle tones, these lessons became part of their upbringing, guiding them without the weight of scolding. The stories gave reasons for boundaries, turning caution into something memorable and meaningful. The stories also reinforced the value of remembrance. Spirits who lingered often did so because they had been forgotten or left without proper rites. In this way, folklore reminded families to honor their ancestors, to light lanterns during Oban, to visit graves, to make offerings at small shrines. Forgetting was dangerous not because spirits were malevolent but because neglect bred sorrow. To remember was to keep harmony, to ensure that the unseen felt acknowledged. This lesson, told softly through stories of lonely spirits, became a cornerstone of communal and family life, encouraging continuity between generations. The moral compass of folklore also extended to the relationship between humans and nature. Forest spirits that misled wanderers were not villains but reminders that the woods were alive and deserved respect. River spirits that lingered in sorrow reminded listeners to treat water with reverence. Stories of mountain figures emphasized humility in the face of the sacred. These narratives aligned moral behavior with ecological awareness long before the term existed. By framing the natural world as alive with unseen presences, folklore instilled in villagers a sense of responsibility, teaching them to walk carefully and gratefully through the environment that sustained them. Importantly, the calm tone of these tales made their lessons easier to absorb. A shouted command might be resisted, but a softly told story lingered in the imagination. When a villager chose to leave an offering at a roadside shrine, when a child chose to stay close to home at dusk, when a family chose to light a lantern for their ancestors, it was not because they had been ordered to, but because they remembered the stories. The power of folklore was not in fear but in suggestion, in the way it allowed moral lessons to become part of the landscape of thought and habit. Over generations, these stories built a quiet code of ethics that shaped the fabric of village life. Respect for elders, kindness to neighbors, humility before nature, remembrance of ancestors, caution in the face of the unknown. All these values were reinforced not with lectures but with the slow telling of ghost stories. To hear such a story before sleep was to absorb its lesson without resistance, to let it settle in the mind like falling snow, soft and persistent. By morning, the listener carried it with them, woven into the rhythm of their life. In this way, folklore became not just entertainment but guidance, not just memory but map. The unseen presences of the countryside were not only figures of mystery, they were teachers, patient and enduring, shaping the lives of those who believed in them. To listen was to learn, and to learn was to live with balance. And so ghost stories, calm, sorrowful, mysterious, served as moral compasses, pointing gently toward lives lived with reverence, compassion and harmony with both the living and the unseen. As the stories of spirits and shadows draw to a close, what remains is not fear but a lingering calm. The world of Japanese folklore, with its gentle ghosts, watchful ancestors and unseen presences in forests and rivers, offers more than tales of the supernatural. It offers a way of seeing life itself. Each story, spoken slowly by the fireside or whispered on a veranda in summer, carried within it a mood that invited listeners into reflection. Instead of shaking them awake with terror, these stories lulled them into sleep with reminders of connection, to family, to nature, to the cycles of time, and to the emotions that bind both the living and the dead. The countryside villagers who first told these tales lived in close rhythm with the land. They worked the rice fields, walked the forest paths, and watched the seasons turn with patience. Their ghost stories reflected this closeness. Spirits were not strangers, but neighbors, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes protective, sometimes reminding, always present. To hear of a lantern glowing on a distant road or a pale figure standing quietly by a river was to be reminded that life was never empty. There were always presences near, unseen but not unfelt, weaving the human world together with something larger. In this way, the stories created comfort. Ancestors returned each summer with lantern light to visit their families. Loyal animals lingered after death to keep watch over the homes they had loved. Spirits in the fields and mountains ensured that crops grew and rivers flowed, so long as respect was shown. Even the sorrowful figures, yūrei in white garments, shadows at the village edge, carried lessons rather than threats. They reminded listeners of the need for compassion, of the importance of remembrance, of the dangers of arrogance and neglect. Wrapped in calm words, these lessons sank deep into the memory of each generation. The act of telling these stories was itself a ritual of community. Families gathered together at night, the glow of a single lantern softening the room, while elders spoke in slow, measured tones. Children leaned closer, wide-eyed but unafraid, listening as the boundaries of the world stretched outward to include voices and figures they could not see. In that shared silence, stories became more than entertainment. They became part of identity, part of the way villagers understood who they were, where they came from, and how they should live. Even now, long after the times of quiet villages and candlelit gatherings, the stories endure. They appear in theatre, in art, in books, and in modern retellings, but their core remains the same, a calm reminder of life's mysteries and the bonds that endure across time. To hear them today is to feel the same slow rhythm, the same gentle unfolding of images that once soothed farmers and children centuries ago. They invite modern listeners, surrounded by noise and haste, to pause, to breathe, to imagine a world where silence is alive and shadows are full of presence. The conclusion of these stories is not an ending, but a continuation. Just as the seasons turn, the stories return, each summer, each winter, each time a family gathers to remember. They flow like rivers, sometimes calm, sometimes heavy with memory, always carrying something forward. In them listeners find reassurance that loss is not emptiness, that sorrow can be softened into remembrance, and that even the unseen can feel familiar. As you drift now into rest, let the images remain with you gently, the lantern woman walking slowly along a quiet road, the faint music drifting through the forest at night, the fireflies above the paddies echoing ancestral lights, the snow-covered fields where a figure moves silently with no footprints left behind. These are not images of fear but of quiet presence, reminders that the world is layered with mysteries that comfort as much as they unsettle. The calm history of Japanese folklore and village ghost stories is not one of nightmares, but of guidance. It speaks softly of how to live, with respect for nature, with reverence for ancestors, with kindness toward others, and with humility before what cannot be seen. To listen to these stories is to be carried into a space between waking and dreaming, where the unseen becomes gentle, and the night becomes full rather than empty. And so, as the story closes, let the words fade like lanterns drifting down a river at the end of Obon, each light carrying memory, each glow guiding the way toward rest. In this fading, there is no fear, only calm, only reflection, only the quiet comfort of knowing that the world, both seen and unseen, moves gently around you, and that sleep, like the stories, carries you into another realm where presence is always near.